Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we enter the quiet world of Miss Marple in Miss Marple and the Secret of the Folded Place card. A vanished guest, a folded card upon the table, and a secret no one dares to speak. Where are you joining us from? Let us know below. Now, pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. It was one of those radiant summer afternoons in St. Mary Mead when even the roses seemed to stand at attention, presenting their blossoms with a kind of ceremonious pride. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had arranged a garden party on the rectory lawn, complete with linen-draped tables, sponge cakes, and an abundance of tea served from a silver urn that gleamed in the dappled sunlight. Children darted between the flower beds, women clustered beneath parasols, and gentlemen, slightly flushed in the heat, exchanged anecdotes about cricket and local politics. The occasion was meant to be nothing more than a cheerful interruption to the village routine, a harmless gathering in which gossip would flutter as freely as the bunting strung from elm to elm. Yet, as every resident of St. Mary Mead had come to accept, tranquility was always an illusion. Beneath the calm surfaces of tea and sponge cake lay small rivalries, bruised egos, and secrets that only required the faintest pressure to rise to the surface. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the edge of the gathering, her knitting needles clicking with calm regularity. To the casual eye, she appeared occupied with her wool, but her pale blue eyes as a jay surveyed everything. She noted how Mrs. Price Ridley leaned ever so slightly away from Mrs. Bantry when the latter spoke too loudly about the new grocer's prices. She observed Colonel Melchett's habit of glancing too often at his pocket watch, as though his thoughts lingered on some pressing engagement elsewhere. And she registered, too, the faint stiffness in young Lydia Armitage's posture when her fiancé, Charles Fortescue, was approached by a laughing young woman from the neighboring village. The highlight of the afternoon, or so Mrs. Clement had declared it to be, a little contest of riddles written on neatly folded place cards and distributed to the guests at tea. It was meant as nothing more than a bit of amusement, but villagers took their amusement seriously. Mrs. Clement bustled about with evident delight, handing out the small cards and pencils. Each guest, in turn, scribbled their answers and folded their cards neatly again. The folded place cards were then placed in a small wicker basket to be read aloud later. It was during this cheerful exchange that the shadow fell. The basket of folded cards had been set on the refreshment table beside a crystal dish of lemon biscuits. Mrs. Clement, flushed with the pleasure of her own cleverness, was preparing to draw the first card when the silence broke suddenly, sharp and chilling. A woman's scream pierced the air. Gasps followed, and in the next moment, all heads turned toward the rose pergola. There, beneath the tumbling crimson blooms, lay Lydia Armitage. Her parasol had fallen aside, her face was ashen, and her gloved hand clutched convulsively at the grass. Charles Fortescue knelt beside her, his voice frantic as he called her name, but Lydia's lips formed no reply. Dr. Haydock, fortunately present, was summoned at once. He pushed his way through the stunned crowd, his professional briskness a stark contrast to the gasping ladies and muttering men. He knelt, pressed his fingers to her wrist, and after a long, grim pause, looked up. "She's gone," he said simply. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Teacups rattled on saucers, whispers rose and collided, and the vicar's wife herself staggered back against the table, her hand clutching at the silver urn as if to steady the world. "Dead?" Mrs. Bantry gasped, her eyes as round as the sponge cakes she had so proudly brought. "Dead," Dr. Haydock repeated, his voice low but firm, "and I do not like the look of it. This was not a fainting fit, nor the sudden collapse of natural causes. I fear we have something far more sinister here." The words were scarcely uttered before speculation began. Mrs. Price Ridley declared at once that the heat had been too much for poor Lydia. Colonel Melchett, more practical, demanded to know whether she had perhaps eaten something disagreeable. The younger folk whispered of wasp stings or of sudden weakness caused by nerves. Yet Miss Marple, who had quietly risen from her chair and stood now with her knitting folded neatly in her bag, saw the world around her with sharper lines. The overturned parasol, the peculiar tension in Charles Fortescue's voice, the strange absence of alarm in one or two faces, these were not things that could be explained by sunstroke or bad sponge cake. Her eyes wandered briefly to the table, where the little basket of folded place cards still sat, waiting to be read aloud. She noticed something about the cards slightly more creased than the others, folded twice over as though with unusual haste. Her eyes lingered there a moment longer before she returned her gaze to the huddled group around Lydia's lifeless body. The garden party, which had begun with laughter and lemon biscuits, was now the scene of death. And though no one yet realized it, the tiny village of St. Mary Mead was about to become the stage for a murder investigation, one in which Miss Marple's unassuming presence would prove to be the quiet force leading them toward the truth. For Miss Marple knew better than most human nature was a puzzle, and even in the calmest of settings, the darkest motives could be folded as neatly and as deceptively as a place card at tea. The days following Lydia Armitage's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead like ripples across a still pond. By the very next morning, every shopkeeper, gardener, and charwoman in the village could recount the precise moment of her collapse, each with some slight variation that made the tale more dramatic than the last. At the High Street grocer, Mrs. Price Ridley leaned heavily on the counter as she declared to anyone within earshot that Lydia had been delicate from birth and quite unsuited to the excitement of a public gathering. I always said, she confided to the shop assistant, that the girl was too highly strung. One never knew when such nerves might prove her undoing. In contrast, Mrs. Bantry, encountered later at the post office, dismissed such talk with a wave of her plump hand. Nerves? Nonsense. She was as robust as a farmhand. No, mark my words, it was poison, one of those dreadful modern things one hears about. Slips into the tea, no taste at all, and down you go. Her words, delivered in a stage whisper, ensured that 2 clerks and 3 customers strained forward to catch every syllable. The younger villagers were even more imaginative. 2 girls at the dressmaker's shop insisted that Lydia must have been stung by a venomous insect. A youth at the public house darkly suggested a romantic quarrel, for it was well known that Lydia and Charles Fortescue were not always the picture of harmony. Speculation spread like wildfire, each theory contradicting the next, but all delivered with the conviction of certainty. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her quiet errands, listening rather more than she spoke. She purchased her half-pound of tea and her usual pat of butter, nodding politely at each pronouncement, her mind sifting through the words with a practiced ear. She had long known that the first explanations given after a tragedy were rarely true, but they were invaluable in revealing what people wished to believe, and more telling still, what they wished to conceal. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was distraught. She insisted to her husband that she could never host another gathering, not after such a calamity. To think, she lamented, that the dear girl should breathe her last beneath my rose pergola. It will be spoken of for years, I am sure. The place will be tainted. Mr. Clement did his best to reassure her, though privately he worried about the scandal attaching itself to the parish. Colonel Melchett, as magistrate, had already spoken with Inspector Slack, who was keen to declare the matter an unfortunate accident. Slack had a fondness for tidy explanations and disliked anything that smacked of village melodrama. Still, Dr. Haydock had been firm in his opinion the circumstances of Lydia's death were highly suspicious. And if Dr. Haydock insisted on further inquiry, even Inspector Slack was obliged to listen. Thus, the inquest was set. Notices were posted, and villagers whispered with an excitement not unlike the anticipation of a fair. For in St. Mary Mead, life was often uneventful, and even the gravest misfortune provided a spectacle. Miss Marple sat in her small cottage parlour, That evening, knitting in her lap, as she reflected on what she had observed, her thoughts were not on gossip, but on the small things that others overlooked. Lydia had not been drinking tea when she collapsed, nor nibbling a biscuit. She had been beneath the pergola, laughing at something Charles had said. The moment had been one of apparent happiness. Yet in that instant, death had seized her. And then there was the basket of folded place cards. Miss Marple could see it still, perched incongruously beside the urn, untouched in the aftermath. One card had caught her attention, not the riddle written upon it, but the manner of its folding. Folded twice over, more tightly than the rest. Such details, she knew, were rarely meaningless. The village, however, concerned itself with grander tales. That very evening at the Women's Institute, Mrs. Bantry declared with relish that Lydia had been involved in some secret affair. "I cannot say with whom," she added, lowering her voice, "but one hears whispers. And where there are whispers, my dear ladies, there is usually a fire smouldering beneath." Miss Hartnell, not to be outdone, responded with indignation. "Rubbish!" She was a well-brought-up young lady. If you want scandal, look no further than her fiancé. Charles Fortescue always did strike me as rather too charming for his own good. By the end of the evening, two camps had formed, those convinced Lydia had died from some hidden weakness, and those persuaded it was foul play, with Charles at the center. The truth, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home beneath the starlit sky, was likely somewhere else entirely. Human nature, after all, was far more complicated than village gossip ever allowed. The following morning brought yet another turn. The maid at the Armitage house, pale and trembling, told a neighbor that the police had been in and out all evening, questioning Mr. Armitage with grave faces. It was whispered that certain items from Lydia's room had been removed for examination, though what they were, no one could quite say. The rumor, as it passed from lips to ears, became embroidered until it was practically a confession of murder. Miss Marple heard all of this, of course, while selecting a skein of pale blue wool at the haberdashery. She said nothing, merely remarking that it was curious how quickly people leapt to conclusions. Curious, she murmured, and most revealing. For she knew that the truth of Lydia Armitage's death would not be found in gossip, nor in conjecture, but in the quiet observation of how people behaved when they thought no one noticed, and Miss Marple, unassuming as ever, noticed everything. The morning of the inquest dawned with a sky of pale grey, as though even the weather acknowledged the seriousness of the day. The village green, normally a picture of calm with children playing and dogs dozing in the sun, was alive with purposeful movement. Men in stiff collars walked briskly, women in their Sunday hats whispered as they clustered at the edges, and bicycles leaned against hedges where their owners had hastened to secure a place. Inside the parish hall, the atmosphere was hushed but electric. Inspector Slack, a solid man with a brusque manner, presided with an air of authority that suggested he had already reached his conclusions. He disliked complications, and in his view, Lydia Armitage's death must have a simple explanation. Poison, perhaps, but more likely some unfortunate weakness of the heart. Dr. Haydock, seated nearby, was less complacent. He had examined Lydia's body with the thoroughness of long practice and had seen enough to unsettle him. "I cannot state the precise cause at present," he had told Slack in private, "but I can assure you this was no natural death. A healthy young woman does not simply expire in the middle of a garden party." Slack, however, disliked being challenged, particularly by the doctor whose professional bluntness pricked his pride. As the proceedings opened, witnesses were called. Mrs. Clement, pale and trembling, gave her account of the garden party, speaking of laughter, riddles, and the sudden scream that had shattered the day. Her voice faltered more than once, and her husband placed a steadying hand on her arm. Mrs. Bantry, by contrast, relished her role. She gave a vivid description of Lydia's final moments, embellishing with dramatic pauses, her eyes darting toward the assembled villagers as if to ensure her audience appreciated her performance. Charles Fortescue was called next. His grief was apparent, though Inspector Slack regarded it with a suspicious eye. Charles recounted how Lydia had been cheerful, how she had laughed at his jest just before she collapsed. He spoke haltingly, as though still stunned by the memory. A murmur rippled through the room when he admitted that Lydia had not eaten or drunk anything immediately prior to her death. That small fact unsettled the tidy theories of food poisoning. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back of the hall, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not speak, nor was she called upon, for she had nothing yet to declare. But she listened with the keenest attention, noting how Mrs. Bantry's eyes flickered toward Charles with almost theatrical emphasis, how Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips in disapproval each time his name was mentioned, and how Charles himself avoided looking at the Armitage family. Hell, altogether. Such silences and glances, Miss Marple knew, were often as telling as words. The inquest adjourned with no firm conclusion. Dr. Haydock requested further analysis, insisting on toxicological examination, though such resources were not easily procured in a village setting. Slack grumbled but agreed, if only to forestall criticism. The villagers filed out, buzzing with speculation, their voices rising the moment they were free of the solemn hall. That afternoon, Inspector Slack made his way to the Armitage house. Sturdy Georgian building set back from the lane behind wrought iron gates. Mr. Armitage received him with a stiff courtesy. The father's grief was evident, but his manner was controlled, almost too controlled. Slack questioned him briskly, asking about Lydia's habits, her health, and her recent behavior. Mr. Armitage's replies were brief, and more than once his eyes strayed toward the staircase, as though unwilling to speak too freely in front of listening ears. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, under the pretext of delivering a small posy of flowers, had called upon Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife, still pale from shock, welcomed her gratefully, eager for the comfort of a sympathetic listener. As Mrs. Clement spoke, wringing her hands over the dreadful misfortune that had occurred on her lawn, Miss Marple's eyes wandered about the parlor. She noted the wicker basket of place cards, now resting on a side table. With gentle courtesy, she asked if she might see them. Mrs. Clement, too distraught to question the request, agreed at once. Miss Marple examined the cards with apparent casualness. Most were folded neatly once, some with small smudges of pencil still visible. But there it was, again the one folded twice over, the crease sharp, almost anxious. She held it a moment longer than the others, before replacing it with care. Nothing in her expression betrayed the thought that stirred within her, though she had no intention of mentioning the card, not yet. That evening, conversation at the Blue Boar Inn was animated. Villagers leaned across tables, their mugs of ale forgotten, as they debated Lydia's fate. Some insisted Charles must have known something his manner had been too strained. Others muttered about Lydia's family, pointing out that the Armitages kept much to themselves, and one never truly knew what occurred behind those gates. Miss Marple, walking home past the inn, caught snatches of their words. She smiled faintly to herself, reflecting that gossip was like smoke. It often revealed the presence of fire, but not its precise source. Her thoughts returned instead to a quieter observation, the way Charles had described Lydia's laughter. There had been affection in his tone, yes, but also something else, a faint edge of guilt, or perhaps fear. As she settled into her armchair with her knitting, the village church clock chiming the hour, Miss Marple considered the small, overlooked details: a folded place card, a young man's strained voice, a father's guarded silence. None amounted to proof, not yet. But she knew with certainty that Lydia Armitage had not died by chance. Someone, somewhere in their tranquil village, carried a secret darker than the summer roses. And if there was one truth Jane Marple had learned in her long life, it was that in small communities, secrets never remained hidden for long. Inspector Slack prided himself on being a man of action. Once the inquest adjourned, he wasted no time in shaping his view of the case. For him, the pieces fit too conveniently to ignore Lydia Armitage had collapsed during a public gathering, her fiancé at her side, her family curiously restrained in their grief. Slack was not a man to chase shadows when a likely culprit stood plainly before him. By the following morning, it was common knowledge across St. Mary Mead that the inspector had fixed his attention firmly on Charles Fortescue. Gossip had prepared the ground for such a suspicion. Charles was handsome, well-liked, and possessed of a charm that some found almost excessive. A man so glib with words, the villagers reasoned, might easily conceal darker impulses. At the High Street, Mrs. Bantry declared with relish that Charles had been all nerves at the inquest, which in her view was proof enough of guilt. "Mark my words," she told her butcher that the young man was hiding something. "People don't tremble like that unless they've a conscience to answer for." The butcher nodded gravely, though whether in agreement or from long habit of indulging Mrs. Bantry was uncertain. Slack, meanwhile, summoned Charles to the station for questioning. The young man appeared pale and weary, his usual air of confidence shaken. Slack, leaning heavily on the desk, fired his questions with a bluntness that left little room for subtlety. What had Lydia eaten that morning? Had there been quarrels between them? Did Charles know of anyone who might have wished her harm? Charles answered as best he could, though his voice wavered. He admitted there had been disagreements, as there are in every engagement. He confessed Lydia had seemed preoccupied in recent weeks, though he could not say why. What he denied firmly, almost desperately, was any knowledge of how she had died. "I loved her," he said, his voice breaking. "Whatever you believe of me, Inspector, I loved her." To Slack it sounded too polished, too convenient. A guilty man might rehearse such phrases, whereas innocence required no such embellishment. He left the interrogation convinced he was closing in on his culprit. Word of Charles's questioning reached the village before the day was out. At the post office, women leaned across counters to exchange knowing glances. At the Blue Boar, men muttered into their pints, wagering how long it would take before an arrest was made. The story, embroidered in the telling, grew until Charles was said to have confessed outright, though in reality no such thing had occurred. Miss Marple, meanwhile, listened to the tide of opinion without joining it. That evening she visited Mrs. Bantry, who was only too delighted to rehearse her views at length. "The inspector is quite right, Jane," she insisted, her eyes bright with conviction. "Young men like that charming on the surface, but hollow underneath. Why, I knew a similar case once, years ago, in a village not unlike ours. It ended in disaster, of course." Miss Marple nodded politely, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Yet her mind worked elsewhere. She recalled Charles' stricken face at the inquest, the way his words seemed pulled from him rather than rehearsed. To her, guilt wore a different mask, defensiveness, anger, or cold detachment. Charles had shown none of these. His manner had been that of a bewildered man trapped in circumstances he scarcely understood. Still, Miss Marple knew appearances could deceive. She allowed herself no firm conclusion, only a cautious awareness that Inspector Slack's certainty might be built on sand. Human nature was rarely so simple as a single suspect and a neat confession. The following day, Dr. Haydock called upon Miss Marple, his expression grim. He confided that he had pressed for toxicological analysis, though results might take time. "I tell you, Miss Marple, this was no fainting fit. There was something foreign in her system through what I cannot yet say." His frustration was evident, for he disliked being unable to offer clear answers. Miss Marple listened quietly, her fingers resting lightly on her knitting. "People do sometimes help matters along," she said softly, though rarely in the way others expect. A young woman engaged, perhaps uncertain of her future, may inspire feelings both tender and quite the opposite. It is remarkable what small resentments may accumulate beneath the surface of daily life. The doctor regarded her keenly, accustomed as he was to her manner of drawing large conclusions from small observations. "Do you think, then, that Charles Fortescue is innocent?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, my dear doctor, that it is too soon to decide anything. But I do not find his grief unconvincing. That in itself may be worth noting." Meanwhile, the Armitage household had grown hushed and tense. Mr. Armitage went about his affairs with stern composure, though his face appeared more lined each day. Servants whispered that he had been closeted in his study with Inspector Slack, their voices raised more than once. Lydia's mother, frail and withdrawn, scarcely left her room. All the while, Charles's name was whispered with suspicion in every corner of the village. Miss Marple, however, paid attention to subtler matters. She had observed how Mrs. Price Ridley's voice sharpened whenever Charles was mentioned, as though she derived a peculiar satisfaction from his plight. She noticed, too, the way certain villagers avoided speaking of Lydia altogether, as though her memory stirred discomfort they preferred to bury. These silences, she reflected, were often more revealing than any loud declaration of guilt. As evening fell, she sat by her window, looking out across the village green. Life seemed to go on much as before. Children played. Men cycled home from work. The church bell tolled the hour. Yet beneath that surface, calm lay fear, suspicion, and perhaps something far darker. For Miss Marple knew that human beings, when pressed by loss and the prying eyes of neighbors, often revealed more of themselves than they intended. And she suspected that Lydia Armitage's death, far from being the act of a single young man in a fit of passion, was bound up in secrets the village had scarcely begun to whisper. Inspector Slack might have his suspect, but Miss Marple knew the truth would not be so easily folded into a single name. For several days, Inspector Slack maintained his confident pursuit of Charles Fortescue. He spoke of progress in the case whenever questioned at the inn or on the high street, though his progress consisted largely of pressing Charles for explanations he could not provide. To the villagers, it seemed only a matter of time before an arrest was made. Some pitied Charles, others spoke of justice being served, but all agreed that the matter was as good as settled. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. She had learned long ago that human behavior was like a tapestry, seemingly simple from a distance, but full of unexpected knots when examined closely. And there was one small knot she could not ignore: the folded place card. It had been on her mind ever since she first saw it, folded twice instead of once, as though its writer had wanted to hide its contents from prying eyes. The riddle it contained was of no significance, some simple wordplay about birds, written in a hurried scrawl, but the way it had been folded, tight and anxious, did not sit well with Miss Marple. She knew such small gestures often revealed what words concealed. Determined to consider the matter further, she visited Mrs. Clement again under the pretext of returning a borrowed book of sermons. The vicar's wife, still fragile from her ordeal, welcomed her in, grateful for companionship. As they sat with tea, Miss Marple casually asked after the place cards. Mrs. Clement, too distracted to think much of it, produced them from the side table once more. Miss Marple examined them with apparent detachment, but her eye returned at once to the curious one. It was Lydia's handwriting, she was almost certain. The hurried slope of the letters, the uneven pressure of the pencil had the restless quality of a young woman pressed for time or troubled in spirit. Miss Marple tucked that thought away, careful not to show her interest. She returned the cards, thanking Mrs. Clement with her usual gentle courtesy. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had just returned from a further examination of Lydia's belongings. He was frustrated, muttering about the difficulty of securing reliable toxicological results. The laboratory in town is weeks behind. We cannot wait forever. Yet Slack grows impatient. He would prefer to blame the young man and be done with it. Miss Marple looked at him with mild sympathy. Haste in such matters rarely leads to truth, she said softly. Then, after a pause, she asked whether Lydia had been writing anything of late. A diary, perhaps, or letters. The doctor frowned. None that I've seen, but her maid did mention something about scraps of paper in her room, folded and tucked into drawers. Nothing remarkable, the girl thought. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. She recalled the place card once more, folded with a kind of urgency. Lydia had been a young woman on the verge of marriage. Such a state often carried with it hidden doubts and unspoken fears. People sometimes confided them in writing when they could not voice them aloud. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack continued to parade his theory. He called at the Blue Boar one evening, taking his pint with deliberate calm, and announced that matters would soon be resolved. These cases always come down to jealousy or quarrels between sweethearts, he declared. It's as old as time. The young fellow may protest, but mark my words, the truth will out. His pronouncement was met with approving nods, for most villagers were content with an explanation that was both familiar and simple. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly at a nearby table with her glass of sherry, noticed how a few faces tightened at Slack's words. Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes glittered with self-satisfaction. Mr. Armitage, seated in the corner, stared down at his untouched drink. And most curious of all, Lydia's friend, a shy young woman named Alice Farrow, shifted uneasily, her hand tightening on her handbag. Miss Marple watched these small movements with interest, for they spoke volumes. The following morning, Miss Marple called upon Alice under the guise of delivering cuttings for her garden. The girl, pale and nervous, invited her in. Their conversation began with ordinary pleasantries, but Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, soon steered it toward Lydia. Alice faltered. She was restless, she admitted at last, excited at times, but often troubled. She spoke less to me these past weeks. I thought it was because of Charles, but perhaps there was something else. She stopped herself, clearly uncertain whether to say more. Miss Marple, seeing her hesitation, offered only a kind smile. My dear, you needn't speak if it pains you. But do remember, sometimes a small thing that seems unimportant can prove of the greatest value. Alice said no more, but her expression told Miss Marple that she knew something she was not yet ready to share. And that, too, was a kind of clue. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving in steady rhythm, she considered what she had learned. The folded place card, Lydia's restless scrawl, the whispered suggestion of private papers, Alice's nervous manner all pointed to something hidden, something beyond the inspector's narrow focus on Charles Fortescue. The village continued to buzz with certainty, convinced the matter was nearly settled. Yet Miss Marple knew better. The truth, she reflected, was rarely found in bold declarations or simple motives. It lay instead in the quiet corners of human life, in the folded papers tucked away, in the half-spoken words of nervous friends, in the gestures that passed unnoticed by most. And she knew, with the clarity of long experience, that Lydia Armitage's secret was whatever it was waiting to be uncovered. The unease that had gripped St. Mary Mead in the wake of Lydia Armitage's death did not subside. Instead, it deepened, branching into new suspicions and quiet feuds that seemed to tangle the village like ivy, creeping over an old stone wall. Though Inspector Slack continued to trumpet his theory of Charles Fortescue's guilt, the villagers themselves found it increasingly difficult to restrain their tongues. In a small place, secrets had a way of slipping into daylight. It began with Mrs. Bantry, whose fondness for storytelling often led her further than she intended. At a tea gathering hosted by Miss Hartnell, She spoke of overhearing Lydia and her father in a quarrel only a fortnight before the fatal garden party. "Raised voices, my dears," she confided, lowering her own for dramatic effect. Mr. Armitage was most severe, and Lydia stormed out of the house with tears in her eyes. One does not quarrel so bitterly unless something very grave is at stake. Her audience, already inclined toward speculation, seized on this. Was it money? A disagreement about her marriage? Or some secret too shameful to speak of aloud? By evening, the tale had grown to suggest that Lydia had threatened to call off her engagement entirely, that her father had forbidden her from doing so, and that Charles had discovered the dispute. Charles himself did not escape confrontation. A group of young men at the Blue Boar, emboldened by drink, accused him openly of deceiving Lydia. You had another girl on the side. One of them jeered, repeating the village whisper that Charles had been seen in the company of a laughing young woman from Much Benham. Charles flushed with anger, denying it hotly, but his protestations were met with knowing smirks. He left the inn with fists clenched, his reputation more bruised than before. Miss Marple, observing these events from her quiet corner, noted the pattern with interest. The villagers were not merely speculating now, they were revealing their own prejudices, dislikes, and longing grievances. Mrs. Price Ridley's relish in condemning Charles, Mrs. Bantry's eagerness to dramatize Lydia's quarrel with her father, the inn's delight in spreading tales of infidelity, all these were less about Lydia than about the villagers themselves. Yet within such fabrications, she knew, the threads of truth were often tangled. Alice Farrow, Lydia's shy friend, remained the most uneasy of all. She avoided gatherings and kept to herself, her pale face and downcast eyes drawing comment. At last, Mrs. Clement, meaning only to help, pressed her gently during a parish committee meeting. "My dear," she said kindly, "if there is anything you—" "No, anything at all. You mustn't keep it to yourself." Alice startled as though struck. "I know nothing," she said too quickly, her voice trembling. "Truly, nothing." But her hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple, seated across the table, saw in that gesture the unmistakable sign of a conscience burdened with more than it dared reveal. Meanwhile, the Armitage household grew increasingly strained. Mr. Armitage's stern composure was beginning to crack. Several times he was heard raising his voice to his wife, who grew paler each day and withdrew further from sight. The servants whispered of locked drawers in his study and of the master burning papers late at night when the rest of the house was asleep. Such whispers reached Miss Marple's ears, carried on the invisible current of village gossip that never failed to find her doorstep. Inspector Slack, however, cared little for such tales. He confronted Charles again, this time in the presence of Mr. Armitage, pressing for inconsistencies in his account. Mr. Armitage's fury was plain. "This is an outrage," he thundered. "My daughter is scarcely cold in her grave, and you hound her betrothed like a common criminal." Charles, pale and shaken, could only insist once more on his innocence, yet his evident distress served only to harden Slack's conviction that he was hiding something. It seemed to the inspector the simplest explanation, and he clung to it with the stubbornness of habit. Miss Marple, by contrast, saw something quite different. In Mr. Armitage's indignation there was not merely grief, but fear. He protested too much, his anger covering something he dared not confess. It reminded her of another case long ago, when a father had concealed his daughter's indiscretions by lashing out at all who questioned her. The memory lingered as she walked home beneath the soft summer dusk. The following morning, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Alice Farrow stood at her door, her eyes red as if from sleepless nights. She clutched a small parcel wrapped in paper. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing anxiously over her shoulder. "But I can't bear it any longer. This was Lydia's. She gave it to me the day before she died. She made me promise not to show anyone, unless something happened. Miss Marple, with her gentle courtesy, ushered the girl inside and seated her by the fire. With trembling hands, Alice unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a few folded scraps of paper, their edges worn from being handled. Miss Marple read them in silence. They were fragments of notes, hastily written in Lydia's hand. Words leapt out from the page phrases of fear, of reluctance, of some burden she could not share. One note, written more firmly than the rest, read, "If they force me, I shall not go through with it. Better disgrace than misery." Miss Marple laid the papers down with care. Her expression was thoughtful, but her voice remained mild. "Thank you, my dear. You have done the right thing." Alice looked at her with desperate eyes. What does it mean? Who would force her? Was it Charles? Miss Marple shook her head gently. "We must not leap to conclusions, but this does tell us one thing. Lydia was not at peace, and those who are not at peace often reveal more to others than they intend." That evening, as the church bell tolled across the quiet fields, Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting, the papers resting beside her. The threads of the tapestry were becoming clearer. A quarrel with her father, a fiancé under suspicion, a young friend burdened with secrets, yet she knew these were not the whole truth. Human nature, with all its jealousies, fears, and small vanities, would reveal more still, and she had a feeling that the next revelation would not come quietly, but with confrontation. The discovery of Lydia's private notes spread through the village like a draught of cold air. Though Miss Marple had received them in confidence, whispers of their existence could not be kept entirely quiet. Alice Farrow's pale face and nervous manner betrayed that something had passed from her hands, and within days the villagers buzzed with theories more elaborate than ever. Some said Lydia had feared her engagement and meant to break it off. Others claimed she had been blackmailed, though no one could agree on who might have held such power over her. Each theory only served to deepen the suspicion against Charles Fortescue, who now walked the lanes of St. Mary Mead with his head bowed, conscious of eyes following him wherever he went. Inspector Slack, delighted with this apparent confirmation of his case, pressed forward with new vigor. "There you have it," he told Dr. Haydock one evening. "The girl herself declared she was unwilling. If Fortescue threatened her, forced her hand, then it's as plain as daylight. Motive, opportunity, and her sudden death all point to him." Dr. Haydock, however, was not persuaded. "Words on scraps of paper prove only her state of mind," he said firmly. "They do not prove who caused it, and I still say her death was no accident of nature. There was something in her system, though our results have yet to name it. Until we know what, it is premature to hang the blame on any one man." Slack snorted, unconvinced, but the doctor's words found a quiet echo in Miss Marple's mind. She had seen too many cases where the obvious suspect was little more than a decoy for deeper mischief. Human beings, she reflected, were adept at hiding their true intentions beneath a veil of commonplace quarrels. It was during this unsettled time that a second shock rippled through the village. On a damp Thursday morning, the Armitage maid rushed into the High Street grocer's, white-faced and breathless, declaring that Mr. Armitage had collapsed in his study. The doctor was summoned at once, and the news spread faster than the church bell could toll. By afternoon, it was known that Mr. Armitage lived, though only just. Dr. Haydock reported that he had suffered a sudden seizure after taking his morning tea. The resemblance to Lydia's final moments did not escape notice, and whispers grew at once. Could it be that the same hand which struck Lydia now sought to silence her father? Inspector Slack strode to the Armitage house in grim determination, his mind quick with possibilities. He suspected Charles still, but the attack on Mr. Armitage unsettled his tidy theory. "It must be connected," he muttered as he interrogated the shaken servants. Yet their accounts offered little clarity. The tea had been prepared as always, by the housemaid, with no one else entering the room. The sugar bowl, however, stood open on the tray, its contents unremarkable to the eye. Miss Marple, who had been invited to call later that day in the guise of offering sympathy, listened more closely than she spoke. She noted the faint smell of burnt paper lingering in the air of the study, and the way Mr. Armitage's desk showed signs of hasty clearing. Several drawers bore fresh scratches around the locks, as though forced or tampered with. She said nothing, merely remarking on the fine roses visible from the window, but her sharp eyes missed little. That evening, the village square was alive with talk. Some insisted Mr. Armitage had poisoned himself out of grief. Others believed Charles, desperate and cornered, had attempted to silence his future father-in-law. A few whispered of darker family secrets, that Lydia's father had known too much, or perhaps too little, of her true affairs. Miss Marple sat quietly at home, her knitting resting in her lap, her thoughts running deeper. 2 attacks, both sudden, both connected to the same family, could not be dismissed as coincidence. Yet the manner of Mr. Armitage's collapse differed in subtle ways from Lydia's. He had survived where she had not. His symptoms, though severe, did not mirror hers precisely. That distinction, small though it seemed, might prove vital. Her reflections were interrupted by a timid knock at her door. It was Alice again, her eyes full of fear. "They say it will be blamed on Charles," she whispered, wringing her hands. "But it wasn't him, Miss Marple." "I know it wasn't. Lydia told me once that her father had secrets, terrible secrets, and that someone in the village would stop at nothing to keep them buried." Miss Marple invited her in, settling her by the fire with quiet patience. "My dear, you must tell me everything you know, even the smallest thing." Alice hesitated, then spoke of a night weeks earlier when she had visited Lydia. She had found her friend pale and agitated, a folded letter clutched in her hand. Lydia had refused to show it, but she had said something that haunted Alice still. She said, "If I disappear, remember that it was written down. They cannot destroy it all." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Alice finished, she laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "You have been very brave. What Lydia confided may indeed be the key. Words written cannot always be silenced by fire." Later, when Alice had gone, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes on the glowing embers. A second attack, scraps of fearful notes, a letter that might still exist. These were not the marks of a simple case of jealousy. The truth lay tangled in layers of fear and concealment, and she knew that until those hidden words were found, no justice could be done for Lydia. The village might continue to chatter, and Inspector Slack might cling to his easy suspect, but Jane Marple sensed they were all circling the edges of a truth more dangerous than they yet realized. The attack on Mr. Armitage left the village in a state of restless unease. Doors that once stood open were now bolted early in the evening, and glances that had been merely curious turned into sharp, suspicious stares. For the people of St. Mary Mead, it was one thing to speculate about Lydia's death at a garden party, quite another to witness her father nearly carried off in his own study. 2 tragedies within the same family spoke not of chance, but of purpose. Inspector Slack moved about with renewed bluster, determined to make progress. He declared loudly at the Blue Boar that he had narrowed matters down and would soon have the guilty party in handcuffs. Yet for all his bravado, he looked less certain in private. The near-fatal attack on Mr. Armitage unsettled his theory of Charles's guilt. Slack's conviction wavered, though his pride would not allow him to admit it. Dr. Haydock remained firm in his belief that some subtle poison or irritant was at play. "It is not the same in both cases," he remarked to Miss Marple one afternoon, "but it is not natural either." Lydia's death was sudden and final. Armitage's collapse bore a different character, violent, yes, but survivable. "That distinction troubles me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It troubles me also," she said, "for it suggests not only calculation, but adjustment, someone experimenting, refining as it were." Human nature can be terribly inventive when fear and self-interest drive it. She did not share all her thoughts with the doctor, but she had already begun a quiet series of tests of her own. It was not in Miss Marple's way to confront suspects with accusations. Rather, she preferred to nudge gently, to observe reactions, to let human nature betray itself in the small, unguarded moments. Her first visit was to Charles Fortescue. She found him pacing the small garden of his lodgings, his face drawn and weary. "My dear young man," she said kindly, "you must not let the talk of the village dishearten you. People say many things, most of them foolish." Charles looked at her in anguish. "But they believe it, Miss Marple. They truly think I had something to do with it. And now with her father, how am I to bear it?" Miss Marple patted his arm, her eyes steady on his face. "It is a hard burden, but grief often makes people speak without sense. If you loved Lydia, as I believe you did, you must hold fast to that." She watched closely as he spoke of Lydia, noting that his sorrow seemed genuine, unfeigned. His anger rose only when he mentioned the inspector's suspicions, not when Lydia's name was spoken. To Miss Marple, that was telling. A guilty man often faltered when speaking of his victim. Charles did not. Her next visit was to Mrs. Bantry, whose delight in the drama of events had not dimmed despite the gravity of the situation. "Depending upon it, Jane," she said briskly over tea, "someone in that house knows more than they admit. Servants always see things. Oh, I've lived long enough to know that. Mark my words, the Armitage household is sitting on a pile of secrets." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, remarked mildly, "Yes, servants do see a lot. But sometimes it is not what they see, but what they are asked to do that reveals the truth." Mrs. Bantry, caught off guard, blinked at her. For a moment her confident chatter faltered, and she busied herself with the teapot. Miss Marple noted the reaction, but said no more. A small prod could be enough to stir unease. Later that same day, she called upon Alice Farrow once more. The girl opened the door nervously, as though expecting reprimand for her earlier confession. Miss Marple reassured her with gentle kindness. "My dear, you did a brave thing. But tell me, did Lydia ever mention the folded riddles at the garden party? She seemed to have written in haste." Alice looked startled, then shook her head quickly. No, she never said anything, only that she dreaded what was coming, that she wished she could escape it." Her words trembled, and she bit her lip as if afraid she had revealed too much. Miss Marple laid her hand over the girl's. "You have been most helpful. Sometimes fear is written not only in words, but in the way we fold a piece of paper." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small parish gathering, ostensibly to discuss the church fete. She listened politely to the arrangements for the cake stall and the flower show, but her true attention was elsewhere. She introduced, with artful casualness, a remark about how dreadful it must be for a family to burn papers so soon after a tragedy, lest they fall into the wrong hands. The room shifted subtly. Mrs. Price Ridley sat upright, her eyes narrowing. Colonel Melchett exchanged a brief glance with his wife. Mr. Armitage's cousin, who had been present, paled and reached for her handkerchief. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, as though she had meant nothing by it, but her sharp eyes catalogued every reaction. She returned home with the quiet satisfaction of progress. Each conversation, each gentle prod, had revealed a little more. Human beings, she reflected, could no more conceal their true selves under pressure than water could stop finding its level. As she sat by her fire, her knitting needles glinting in the lamplight, Miss Marple considered her next step. There would be another test, something more deliberate, something that would touch directly on the heart of the matter. The time was coming when she would have to press more firmly to see who flinched when the truth was near. For though Inspector Slack might believe the case nearly solved, Jane Marple knew they were only now approaching the point where human nature, if nudged just so, would reveal its hidden hand. The village had settled into a peculiar rhythm, one of outward normality and inward disquiet. Life continued. The baker delivered his loaves, the postmistress sorted her letters, and children played along the green, but beneath every polite exchange lingered the same unspoken thought: someone among them had killed Lydia Armitage, and perhaps tried to kill her father as well. Inspector Slack continued to insist on Charles Fortescue's guilt, though even he had grown uneasy. The second incident weighed on him, for it refused to fit neatly into his theory. Still, he blustered about the lanes, determined to preserve authority, declaring that the evidence pointed one way, while avoiding mention of the evidence that did not. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with her usual quiet grace through the village, dropping remarks here and there like pebbles into a pond, watching the ripples they caused. She had long since learned that people revealed themselves not under direct questioning, but in the small betrayals of expression and tone when a nerve was touched. At the post office, she mentioned idly to Mrs. Price Ridley that Mr. Armitage's collapse was most peculiar, given how careful he always seemed about his habits. Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened, declaring too quickly that she had heard nothing unusual about the Armitage household. Her eagerness to dismiss the subject told Miss Marple far more than her words. At the vicarage, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Clement as she lamented once more the dreadful events that had tainted her garden party. One cannot imagine, Mrs. Clement sighed, why anyone would wish to harm such a sweet girl. But her eyes slid away as she spoke, and Miss Marple noted the faintest flicker of guilt in her expression, perhaps not guilt of the deed, but guilt of knowledge withheld. It was during an afternoon walk that Miss Marple encountered Colonel Melchett. He greeted her with stiff courtesy, then spoke with unusual fervor. "This business has gone on long enough, Miss Marple. The inspector must act. A village cannot live under a cloud forever." His words were meant to sound authoritative, but Miss Marple caught the strain in his voice. Pressure, she thought, was making cracks appear in more than one facade. Meanwhile, Charles Fortescue had grown desperate. He came to Miss Marple himself, pale and drawn, and begged her to believe in his innocence. "I cannot sleep, Miss Marple," they whisper, "wherever I go. Even Lydia's family will not look at me. If only I could prove," he broke off, his voice unsteady. Miss Marple reassured him gently, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of Lydia's words, written in haste. "If they force me, I shall not go through with it." Who had forced her, and why did that person now seek to silence all traces of her protest? That evening, Miss Marple invited Alice Farrow to tea. She spoke of ordinary things at first, the dahlias in the garden, the weather, and the price of butter. Then she said softly, "It is a curious thing how people sometimes destroy papers when they fear discovery. And yet fragments often survive. Even the smallest scrap may tell its tale." Alice's hands trembled as she lifted her teacup. "I think there may be something more. I was afraid to say before." She confessed that Lydia had once entrusted her with a key, pressed into her hand with urgent instructions to keep it hidden. Alice had forgotten it in her panic, but she now produced it from her handbag. It was a small brass key, unmarked, yet clearly belonging to a locked drawer or box. Miss Marple accepted it calmly, though inwardly she felt the quiet certainty of progress. She asked no questions that might frighten the girl, only thanked her for her trust. When Alice departed, Miss Marple sat long by her window, the key resting in her palm. It was, she felt sure, the key not only to a drawer, but to the heart of the matter. The next day, tension in the village deepened further when Mr. Armitage, though recovering, received an anonymous note slipped beneath his door. Its contents were not made public, but the maid whispered that it had left him white-faced and trembling. Some said it was a threat. Others claimed it was a warning. Either way, it confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. The net was tightening, and the guilty party was feeling the strain. That evening, at the Women's Institute meeting, Miss Marple made her most deliberate test yet. She told a simple story of another village, years ago, where a young woman had been forced into a marriage she did not want. The tale ended with the young woman's sudden death, and with the guilty party revealed only because a trivial paper scrap had survived the fire. She delivered it as though it were merely a cautionary anecdote, but her eyes, though mild, watched each face. Mr. Armitage's cousin paled and fidgeted with her gloves. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed and looked away. Colonel Melchett's jaw tightened, and one villager silent till now suddenly rose and excused himself, his face drawn and strained. Miss Marple tucked her knitting back into her bag. She had seen what she needed to see. Reactions, she knew, were as revealing as confessions. The guilty could not help but betray themselves when the shadows of truth drew near. The following morning, Inspector Slack arrived at her cottage, puffed up with his usual importance. "We're closing in, Miss Marple," he announced. "Another day or two and we'll have the handcuffs on Fortescue." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Perhaps, Inspector. Yet one must be careful not to grasp at the wrong thread. A knot in the tapestry may look like the whole pattern, but only when one steps back does the true design emerge." Slack looked puzzled, muttered something about old ladies and riddles, and departed. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, serene as ever, though her mind was far from tranquil. For she knew the time was coming when she must draw the net tighter still, so tight that the guilty party, unable to escape, would reveal themselves fully. The days that followed seemed to draw St. Mary Mead into a silence more oppressive than chatter. The villagers, so quick to gossip before, now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to one another as if afraid of what might be revealed next. The anonymous note delivered to Mr. Armitage had unsettled them all. Its words were not known to the public, yet the sight of the Manston, though he usually appeared reeling as though struck, had been enough to inspire dread. Inspector Slack attempted to ride this wave of fear by declaring, with greater bluster than ever, that Charles Fortescue would soon be placed under arrest. He spoke loudly of evidence mounting, though in truth he had little beyond conjecture and public suspicion. Some villagers nodded, relieved to have a scapegoat. Others remained doubtful. And Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting, quietly smiled at the inspector's impatience. For Miss Marple had begun to see the shape of the tapestry more clearly. Each strand of gossip, each nervous glance, each hastily concealed piece of paper, it all pointed to a truth that was not yet spoken aloud. She had in her possession the key Alice had entrusted to her, and she suspected it would open not only a drawer, but the very heart of the mystery. Her first step was to pay another call upon the Armitage household. Mr. Armitage received her with strained politeness, his complexion still pale from his recent collapse. He attempted to keep the conversation light, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence led him to grow defensive. "My affairs are my own, Miss Marple," he said sharply when she inquired after his health. "The inspector may pry, but I will not have others speculate on my private matters." Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression mild. Yet she noted the fresh scratches around the drawer of his desk, and how his hand trembled as he shut it firmly. Fear, she reflected, was beginning to press too close for comfort. Later that afternoon, she visited Alice Farrow once more. The girl was pale, her nerves stretched thin. "I fear I've brought trouble, Miss Marple," she whispered. "If they discover I gave you the key, courage, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Sometimes the smallest act of bravery shines brightest. If Lydia trusted you, then you have done well to honor that." Trust Alice's eyes filled with tears, but she seemed comforted. Miss Marple knew the girl had already risked much, but there was little to be gained by keeping the key hidden. The following evening, Miss Marple attended another gathering at the vicarage, this time a parish committee meeting to discuss the church roof. It was an ordinary occasion on the surface, but Miss Marple had chosen her moment with care. She allowed herself to mention, quite idly, the matter of old letters sometimes hidden in locked drawers, and how remarkable it was that such things could resurface when least expected. The reaction was immediate. Mr. Armitage's cousin, who had been sitting quietly by the hearth, shifted uncomfortably and dropped her knitting. Colonel Melchett's jaw tightened. Mrs. Price Ridley coughed with unnecessary force, as though to drown out the remark, and Mr. Armitage himself, though silent, gripped the arm of his chair so hard that his knuckles whitened. Miss Marple, serene as ever, took note of every twitch and tremor. Inspector Slack, who had been invited by the vicar to reassure the villagers, looked baffled by the undercurrents. He repeated his usual assertions about Charles Fortescue and urged patience, but his words rang hollow. Even the villagers, once content with simple explanations, began to feel there was more at work than the inspector admitted. The very next morning brought confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicion. The Armitage maid, trembling with fear, confided to Mrs. Bantry that she had seen her master burning letters in the grate late at night, long after the household was supposed to be asleep. They were folded small, like notes, she whispered, and he fed them to the fire as though desperate to be rid of them. Within hours, the story was all over St. Mary Mead, embroidered with every telling. Miss Marple, hearing of it, was not surprised. She suspected that what Mr. Armitage had sought to destroy was connected to Lydia's restless scribblings in the folded place card. But she also knew that destruction often left behind traces. A note half-burnt, a word remembered by a witness, a drawer not quite locked. These things were rarely erased completely. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, her knitting needles at rest. She thought of Lydia, a young woman caught between duty and dread. She thought of Charles, bewildered and wrongly accused. She thought of Alice, burdened by a secret she scarcely understood. And above all, she thought of the faint but undeniable signs of panic now surfacing in those who most insisted on their composure. It was nearly time. She would need to bring the threads together, to test them one final time. Human nature, pressed firmly enough, would always yield its truth. Miss Marple rose and set aside her knitting. Tomorrow, she decided, she would make her move. Not with bluster, not with threats, but with the quiet precision of a needle finding its place in the fabric. The guilty party was already fraying at the edges. One more gentle tug, and the whole pattern would unravel. The morning after her decision, Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose. She wrote a few notes, each in her neat, spidery handwriting, and sent them by hand through young Tommy the errand boy. The recipients were varied: Mr. Armitage, Colonel Melchett, Mrs. Price Ridley, Alice Farrow, Charles Fortescue, and even Mrs. Bantry, who was always eager to be included. Each was invited to the vicarage at 4 o'clock that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss matters of parish concern. Mrs. Clement, flustered but obliging, agreed at once when Miss Marple explained her request. "Of course, dear Miss Marple, though I confess I do not see how it will help. Still, if it brings clarity, then so much the better." By the appointed hour, the drawing-room of the vicarage was filled with uneasy figures. Mrs. Price Ridley sat stiffly, her lips pressed tight. Colonel Melchett leaned on his cane with soldierly impatience. Alice hovered near the door, pale and nervous. Charles stood apart, his arms folded, looking both resentful and despairing. Mr. Armitage, still worn from his collapse, arrived last, his manner grave and reluctant. Mrs. Bantry, by contrast, was bright-eyed with anticipation, eager to witness whatever drama might unfold. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her knitting in her lap. She began in her gentle, apologetic voice, the one that always seemed to disarm her audience. "I am most grateful to you all for coming. Matters in our village have caused great distress, and I fear the inspector's conclusions, though energetic, may not have reached the true heart of things. I thought it best we talked together, calmly and quietly, to see whether the pattern might not reveal itself. Colonel Melchett frowned. "With respect, Miss Marple, this is the inspector's business. We cannot conduct an investigation in a parish drawing-room." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so, Colonel, and yet sometimes truth comes to light in the simplest of settings, when people are brought face to face. You see, it is not forensic matters that reveal human nature, but words spoken, glances exchanged, and the little ways we betray ourselves." She let her words settle. Her eyes, seemingly mild, moved across the group. Tension stirred in the air. Miss Marple then turned to Alice, speaking gently. "My dear, you were brave to share what Lydia confided to you. Those notes, those words of dread, they tell us much. But there was more, was there not? A key she entrusted to you which speaks of things hidden." Alice's cheeks flushed and she nodded, producing once more the small brass key. "Yes," she said, "it must be kept safe." Miss Marple took it, holding it delicately between her fingers. "A key is a curious thing. It tells us that something was locked away, something Lydia feared others might find. One must ask, what would a young woman, soon to be married, need to hide from those closest to her?" Her words caused a stir. Mrs. Price Ridley cleared her throat sharply. Mr. Armitage shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the key with an intensity he seemed unable to mask. Miss Marple continued as though she had not noticed. "We also know that papers have been burned, destruction done in haste late at night when most of the house was abed. Yet destruction is never complete. Fragments survive, memories linger, and the truth has a way of remaining, however much one might wish it gone." At this, Mr. Armitage spoke, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "This is an idle prattle, Miss Marple. My daughter is dead, and I will not sit here while her memory is picked over like a carcass." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "I understand your pain, sir. Yet sometimes the love of a father, or the protection he believes he offers, can take forms that bind more than they free. Lydia herself wrote of being forced. It was not marriage, she feared it was compulsion, and compulsion breeds despair." There was a silence, heavy and uncomfortable. Charles looked up sharply, his face stricken. "She feared me, then? Is that what you're saying?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear young man. She did not fear you. Her words spoke of something deeper, of burdens pressed upon her by others." Her gaze swept the room again, resting briefly on Mrs. Price Ridley, whose hands clenched in her lap, then on Colonel Melchett, whose eyes flickered uneasily. At last, it came to rest on Mr. Armitage, who sat rigid, his jaw tight, as though holding back a torrent. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger. People, she knew, could not bear silence for long. They rushed to fill it, and in doing so, they revealed themselves. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, unable to resist. But surely, Jane, if Lydia was in danger, it must have been from someone in her own home. Who else could have forced her so? The words hung in the air. Mr. Armitage's face flushed, then paled. Alice gave a small cry, as though some half-guessed truth had suddenly struck her. Charles stood frozen, his breath shallow. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly and placed it in her basket. Her voice, still gentle, carried a weight that made them all lean closer. "I think, my friends, that we are very near the truth. The tapestry is almost complete. But before the last stitch is drawn, I must ask you all to consider carefully what does it mean when a place card is folded twice, when papers are burned in the night, and when a young woman writes that disgrace is preferable to misery." The question lingered, unanswered. Each face bore the mark of strain, each heart thudded with unspoken fear. Miss Marple's eyes, serene yet piercing, surveyed them all. She knew the time had come for the final unraveling, but she would not speak it yet. The pattern was visible only to her, and the moment of revelation quiet, devastating and precise, was almost at hand. The silence in the vicarage drawing room pressed upon the gathering like a heavy curtain. Each person sat with their own unease, waiting for someone to speak, but no one dared. At last, Miss Marple broke the stillness, her voice as mild as ever. "You see," she began, "when one considers Lydia's final words, her notes, and even the way she folded that little place card, it becomes clear that she was not a carefree young woman at all. She was troubled, deeply so, and troubled people often leave behind the faintest of trails, trails that those who observe carefully may follow." Her eyes fell gently upon Charles. "You, my dear young man, were the obvious suspect. Too obvious, in fact. The inspector was eager to settle the matter upon your shoulders, and the village followed eagerly enough. But your grief, though heavy, has never rung false to me. You loved Lydia, but you did not seek her end." Charles lowered his head, his eyes wet, as though a great weight had been lifted. Mrs. Bantry gave a small gasp of disappointment, deprived of the easy culprit she had so enjoyed discussing. Miss Marple turned then to Alice, whose hands trembled in her lap. "You did bravely, my dear, in keeping her trust. The key you held was more than a trinket. It was the key to Lydia's secret life. She wrote in haste, in fear, and she hid her words because she knew they would condemn someone close to her." Alice nodded faintly, her lips pressed tight, as if she had long suspected the truth, but dared not voice it. Miss Marple's gaze rested finally upon Mr. Armitage. He sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him, flashing with anger, fear, and defiance, all at once. "It was you, was it not?" Miss Marple said softly. "Lydia's father, who loved her fiercely but sought to control her fate. She wished to be free of the marriage you had arranged. She resisted, and you could not bear it. You feared disgrace more than her misery, and so you pressed her until she despaired. And when her resistance threatened to spill into the open, you silenced her with poison." The room erupted in a chorus of gasps. Mrs. Price Ridley muttered something inaudible, Mrs. Bantry clutched at her pearls, and Colonel Melchett let out a low exclamation of horror. Mr. Armitage's lips twisted. "You dare accuse a mean old man, broken by grief, of such monstrous cruelty?" Miss Marple did not flinch. "Yes, because the truth is woven plainly enough. You burned her notes, but too late. Fragments survived, entrusted to her friend. You tried to destroy suspicion by shifting it toward Charles. But the second attempt, the one that nearly killed you, revealed more than it concealed. It was a desperate effort to make it seem you, too, were a victim. Yet your symptoms differed. The dose was smaller, meant to alarm rather than kill. A man who poisons himself for show is not one who seeks death, but one who seeks sympathy." Her words struck like quiet hammers, each falling with measured weight. Mr. Armitage's composure wavered, his breathing heavy. At last he leaned forward, his voice low and bitter. "She was my daughter, mine to protect, mine to guide. She would have thrown herself away, disgrace, ruin. I could not permit it. Better she should be silenced than bring shame upon us all." The confession hung in the air, dreadful in its calmness. Alice covered her face with her hands. Charles stared in disbelief, his body trembling. Colonel Melchett rose, his voice firm, and placed a hand on Mr. Armitage's shoulder. "That will do. You will answer for this." Inspector Slack, who had arrived belatedly and stood by the door, looked stunned, his certainty crumbling. He muttered something about never trusting old ladies and their riddles, but he knew the case was finished. Miss Marple folded her knitting back into her basket. "It is a terrible thing, to love with such possessiveness that it becomes destruction. Lydia deserved better. In her last little act, in the way she folded that place card, she tried to signal her unrest. Human nature, you see, leaves its mark in the smallest of gestures." The gathering dispersed in solemn silence. Mr. Armitage was taken away, his head bowed, his figure shrunken. Charles walked alone into the dusk, free of suspicion, but burdened with sorrow. Alice lingered only long enough to thank Miss Marple in a whisper before hurrying off, tears glistening on her cheeks. The following days in St. Mary Mead were filled with subdued chatter. The garden party, once meant as a light amusement, was spoken of in hushed tones. The villagers shook their heads over the cruelty of it all, each one secretly relieved that the darkness had been exposed. Miss Marple returned to her quiet routine, her garden and her knitting her chief companions once more. Yet when Mrs. Bantry came to call, eager for every detail, Miss Marple said only, "It is always the same, you know. People are much alike in villages everywhere. Pride, fear, vanity, love, these are the seeds of mischief. And it takes very little for them to grow into tragedy." She smiled gently, though her eyes were sad. For she knew, as she always had, that beneath the calm surface of ordinary life, human nature was forever weaving its hidden patterns, and she, patient as ever, would be there to read them.